writing the equations for sine and cosine functions from their graphs. Today we're going to look at how to find the equation for cosine and sine from their given graphs. Now it's important to remember that we're told this is cosine, so we're using f of x equals a times the cosine of parentheses b, parentheses x minus c, double parentheses plus d, where d is my vertical shift, c is my phase shift, b is relative to the period, and a is my stretch. So when I look at this graph, I'm told it's cosine. For cosine, the peak of my graph should be on the y-axis, which it is, so that means there's not going to be a phase shift. All right, so the things we need to find for this are amplitude, period, and then a vertical shift or a phase shift, if there is one. All right, and as we said, since the peak is on the y-axis, we already know there's not going to be a phase shift. So let's find the amplitude. So the peak is at 2, and the lowest point is at -2. That means that is 4 units. The amplitude is half of the entire top to bottom of the graph. So if it's 4 units from top to bottom, my amplitude is 2. All right, so 1, 2 units. That means that my midline is my x-axis. So since my midline is on the x-axis, I know there is no vertical shift, okay? We also said that cosine is supposed to start with the peak on the y-axis, and since the peak is on the y-axis, we also know there is no phase shift. So the last thing we need to find is period. All right, so if I go from peak to peak, that gives me my period. So in this case, my period is 360 degrees. And that's important to know that it's in degrees because that's going to affect how I find all my pieces. Now, amplitude is A, vertical shift is D, phase shift is C. Period is not B. When I find B, B is equal to 1 full rotation of a circle. So since this is in degrees, the full rotation is 360 degrees. So B is 360 degrees divided by, so 1 full rotation of a circle, divided by whatever my period is. Since my period is also 360 degrees, that means that B is 1. All right, so when I'm ready to write my equation, I'm going to plug into the one that I had at the top. So A is 2 times the cosine of B, which is 1, parentheses x minus a phase shift of 0 plus a vertical shift of 0. All right, so I would be finished, but I need to distribute this 1. All right, and my 0 is going to end up going away. So my final equation becomes f of x equals 2 times the cosine of 1 times x, which is x, 1 times 0, which is 0, and then 0 over there. So this ends up being f of x equals 2 times the cosine of x. All right, so here's another cosine graph. It's going to be very similar to what we did. We have a times the cosine of parentheses b, parentheses x minus c, parentheses, parentheses plus d, where a is my amplitude, b is relative to my period, c is my phase shift, d is my vertical shift. So first thing I want to identify is the peak of my graph on the x-axis, or sorry, on the y-axis. Yes, it is. So here's my peak. All right, so I already know that there's not going to be a phase shift, okay? So let's go with what we know how to do. So there's the top of the graph, there's the bottom. That is 1, 2, 3, 4 units. So my amplitude is half of that, which is 2. If I count to half of that, halfway between those 2 points is at 4. That means my midline is no longer the x-axis. It is now 4. That gives me a vertical shift. So I know that there is a vertical shift of positive 4. All right. Now, since my peak is on the y-axis, we know once again there's no phase shift. So that's 0. But now we have to find my period. All right, so notice that my units for my x-axis are in radians. So my period from peak to peak is 2 pi. All right, so that means I have to find B. So 1 full rotation of a circle in radians is 2 pi. So I have 2 pi divided by my period, which is also 2 pi. So B ends up being 1 again. So once I have amplitude, vertical shift, period, and phase shift, and I solve for B, I'm ready to plug into my equation, and then I'm going to simplify. So A is 2, so that's 2 times the cosine of B, which is 1 parentheses x minus 0, because I don't have a phase shift, but now I do have a plus 4. So when I solve this, I'm still going to have that plus 4 tagged on at the end. So my answer ends up being f of x equals 2 times the cosine of, distribute the 1, so 1 times x is x, 1 times 0 is 0, so I don't have to write anything, and then I still have that plus 4 at the end. For my last cosine graph, I'm still using a times the cosine of parentheses b parentheses x minus c parentheses plus d. So I'm still using that same equation every time. I'm going to find the same 4 pieces of information: my amplitude, my period, my phase shift, and my vertical shift. All right, so let's start with the things that I know. All right, so notice that the peak of my graph is not on the y-axis, so there is going to be some sort of phase shift. Also notice that the unit is in radians, so I'm going to have to use that dealing with my period. All right, so let's start with amplitude. There's the peak, there's the valley, that's 2 units. Half of 2 units means I have an amplitude of 1. All right, the midline is at 1, so that means there's a vertical shift of 1. Now in this case, my period is pi over 2. All right, because if I go from, I can go from any point, but if I go from 0 to here, that's where it repeats. That gives me a period of pi over 2. All right, so when I do my phase shift, all right, I have to figure out that this part is supposed to be on the y-axis, and it has shifted over 2 blocks. So if I think about it, it shifted over half of pi over 2, and half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. All right, so now I have to find out what B is. So 1 full rotation is still 2 pi, but now I'm dividing that by pi over 2. So when I divide by a fraction, I can actually multiply by the reciprocal. So I can say this is 2 pi times 2 over pi, which means my pi's would cancel out, and 2 times 2 would give me 4. So B is 4. All right, so now I know what A is, I know what B is, I know my phase shift, and I know my vertical shift. So I can plug in. So A is 1 times the cosine of B, which is 4, parentheses x. Now this is to the right, so it's going to be minus pi over 4, parentheses, plus 1. So once I've solved this, I'm going to end up distributing that 4, and that's going to change what it looks like inside the parentheses. All right, so my final equation equals f of x equals the cosine of 4 times x, which is 4x, 4 times pi over 4 would give me minus pi, close parentheses, plus 1. So I end up with cosine of 4x minus pi plus 1. The birds sound awfully pretty today. See? This is supposed to be a sine graph, but I forgot to print one out that said find the equation for the sine graph. But we're using a very similar function to what we just did for cosine. So f of x equals a times the sine of b, parentheses x minus c, parentheses, plus d. Now, the difference between sine and cosine, when I look at the graph, is they almost look the same, but the sine is supposed to start at 0, 0, and then go up and then down. So the place where sine actually starts is on the y-axis, but it's halfway between a peak and a valley. All right, so in this case, since this one is halfway between a peak and a valley and it is on the y-axis, this one does not have a phase shift. right? So we know that this one has a phase shift of 0, but we're still finding all the same things that we had to find for my cosine. All right, we're still finding amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift. Now, when I find period, I'm still going to find B the same way I did before as well. It's essentially the exact same thing. The only difference is where the graph of sine starts and where the graph of cosine starts. All right, so let's start with my amplitude. The top is at 3, the bottom is at -1. That is 4 units. Half of 4 is 2. All right, so my amplitude is 2. If I count down 2, that puts my midline at 1. If my midline is 1, then I have a vertical shift of 1. All right, as I said, since the halfway between a peak and a valley is only y-axis, there is no phase shift, but now we have to find my period. So if I go from where it's supposed to start to where it repeats itself, it has a period of 4 pi. So just like before, I need to find out what B is. 1 full rotation of a circle in radians is 2 pi, so it's 2 pi divided by 4 pi, which equals 1/2. So B in this case is 1/2. There's no phase shift, so we can start solving. All right, so my amplitude is 2 times the sine of B, which is 1/2 of x minus 0, since there is no phase shift, plus a vertical shift of 1. All right, so my final answer is f of x equals 2 times the sine of, when I distribute the 1/2, it just gives me 1/2 x, close parentheses, because 1/2 times 0 is 0, and then I have my plus 1 at the end. Here's another sine function. If I look at it, I should clearly see there's some type of vertical shift, and there may be something dealing with my amplitude, but we'll find out in just a minute. So we're using a times the sine of b, parentheses, x minus c, parentheses, parentheses, plus d. I'm finding all the same things I found for every example I've done so far: amplitude, period, vertical shift, and phase shift. All right, so let's check and see where it starts. All right, so it's supposed to start on the y-axis and then go up. So that is halfway between a peak and a valley. That is where it's supposed to start. So once again, this one doesn't have a phase shift. All right, let's find the amplitude. The top of my graph is at -3/2, and the bottom of my graph is at -4/2. So that means my amplitude is half of 1 unit. So my amplitude is 1/2. All right, now my period is from where it starts to where it repeats itself, which is at pi. So my period is only 1 pi. All right, now we also said that my amplitude is 1/2, which puts my midline at -4. So that means I have a vertical shift down 4. All right, so I can start plugging into that equation. So 1/2 for A times the sine of, I forgot to find out what B is. So B is 1 full rotation in radians, which is 2 pi, divided by pi. So B is 2. All right, so it's 1/2 sine of 2, parentheses, x minus 0, because there is no phase shift, minus 4 at the end because it's a vertical shift down 4. So my final answer is f of x equals the sine of, well, that's wrong because I wrote it right there. So it should be f of x equals 1/2 the sine, distribute the 2, which gives me 2x, and then a minus 4 at the end. My last sine graph is a little bit bigger. It looks a little bit different, and notice where it starts. All right, the peak is on the y-axis, so it looks kind of like a cosine, but since we're told it's sine, I automatically should know that there is some sort of phase shift. So once again, I'm using a times the sine of b, parentheses, x minus c, parentheses, parentheses, plus d. I also have to find all those things that I had to find before: amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift. All right, so let's start. Let's find my amplitude. So the top is at 5, the bottom is at -3. That's a total of 8 units. So my amplitude is half of 8. So my amplitude is 4. If I count down 4 units, 1, 2, 3, 4, that puts my midline at 1. So I have a vertical shift of 1. Now, part of the reason I like finding the midline is because that also helps me find my phase shift. So if the sine is supposed to start at halfway between a peak and a valley on the midline, then that means that this is shifted to the left pi units. So this is minus pi. All right, when I plug this in, since this already says x minus c, I have to remember that my sign is actually going to change. All right, but now I have to find my period. So if I just go, an easy way to do it is from peak to peak. So peak to peak is still 4 pi. So I have a period of 4 pi. So when I find b, it's 1 full rotation, which is 2 pi divided by 4 pi, which gives me a b of 1/2. All right, so now I'm ready to start solving. So a is 4, so that's 4 times the sine of b, which is 1/2, parentheses, x. Now, so this is going to be minus negative pi. So minus a negative makes it plus pi, parentheses, parentheses, plus 1. So since this was minus pi for my phase shift, and it's supposed to be x minus c, so it's minus a negative, and that's why it became plus. All right, so now I'm ready to distribute that 1/2 and solve, and so I end up with f of x equals 4 times the sine of distribute. That gives me 1/2 x. 1/2 times pi gives me plus pi over 2, close parentheses, plus 1. So f of x equals 4 times the sine of 1/2 x plus pi over 2 plus 1.